Today for ADG Pro, we're taking a look back at Raptor Call of the Shadows, a 2D shooter I haven't really played in ages now, and which I never really expected to go back to. Way back when I covered it in episode 60 of Ancient DOS Games back in 2011, I made it quite clear that I wasn't really a huge fan of this game due to some of its weird design quirks, such as the increasing difficulty per sector cleared, or the extremely basic boss attack patterns, but I fully understand why a lot of people love this thing, especially considering it didn't really have a lot of options for highly polished DOS shmups way back in the 90s. Well, a number of things have transpired since that review. Firstly, this game's creator, Scott Host, and I have been following each other on social media for a while now, as he's been planning to remake this game at some point in the future, and wants to incorporate some of my feedback from that old review. Plus, he just recently finished revitalizing a different 2D shooter of his from the 90s, which we're going to take a quick look at near the end of this video, just as a sort of bonus mini-review, since there's not really enough to say about it to dedicate a full video to. Not with my level of 2D shooter skills anyways. Scott's clearly way better at playing them than I am. Secondly, as a direct result of playing that other shmup, I've actually gained a bit better insight into Scott's design philosophy, and it was something I hadn't really realized about Raptor up until I tried applying some of that logic in playing that game towards Raptor. You see, normally when you play a 2D shooter, you kinda want to shoot everything and take risks to leave nothing left alive. But Scott intentionally designs his shooters so that you have to pick and choose your battles in every moment, fully intending for you to leave at least about a third of everything undestroyed. And yeah, that's actually a real word, go look it up. Anyways, playing Raptor got a little easier once I realized intentionally avoiding some enemies while focusing on others made it way easier to stay alive. But there's just one little catch, and it's something that's been bothering me about this game for the longest time. Just how good are the different weapons you can acquire? Raptor Call of the Shadows has 14 different weapons you can acquire for your fighter craft. 15 if you count the screen-shattering Megabombs, 16 if you count ramming targets with your craft as a weapon. However, these all cost money, and a lot of it. The earliest weapon you can acquire, not counting your starting guns, are the air-to-air missiles for 63,500 credits. But the last weapon you can acquire, the twin lasers, cost a staggering 1.75 million credits, nearly 28 times the cost, and yet the amount of money you earn throughout the course of the game stays pretty consistent. You really have to save up to get those twin lasers. So yeah, the goal for today is to try and investigate the weapons and see if we can figure out the damage rates of them all, as well as how well that translates into a damage per cost ratio, so we can figure out which weapons give you the best bang for the buck. However, before we can begin, we need to do some preliminary work to ensure that we get everything right, especially considering we have virtually no raw numbers for anything, meaning figuring out the raw numbers is going to be a little tricky. Fortunately, the game gives us a few tools we can take advantage of. The first is the Ion Scanner, which is a cheap 10,000 credit purchase and permanently lets us see the health bars for the bosses. We have to be careful though, because we don't have an immediate way of knowing how many hit points the health bar represents, and it may be different for each boss. The second thing we can take advantage of though is a special God mode, which is activated in one of the most interesting ways I've ever seen for a DOS title, using an environment variable. Now, this is something I don't think I've ever had to explain, but one of the ways in which DOS is able to ensure certain hardware and TSRs work as intended is by allowing environment variables to be set, which are held in memory and can be accessed by any software being run. Now, this is done with the set command, whereby if you just type set by itself and hit enter, you get a list of all environment variables presently set along with their values. To enable God mode in Raptor, you need to type in set space s_host equals castle and hit enter. We can see now that this has created a new environment variable called s_host and it's given it a value of castle. When we go to run Raptor, it checks the value of the s_host environment variable, sees the correct value in it, and turns on God mode, which not only provides full invulnerability to all enemy attacks, but also allows you to start new pilot files with a whole ton of money and one copy of every weapon in the game. We do have to be a little careful about this though, as in order to measure damage rates properly, we're better off testing the weapons individually, one at a time. with 3 of the weapons you can acquire being always equipped, meaning they fire just by having them. Well, it's not possible to not have a selectable weapon selected when you have at least one available. Unfortunately, for the sake of our testing, we can sell any weapons we have, including the starting machine guns, which, yes, you can purchase again following, but this makes it possible to test every single weapon individually. During my preliminary testing, I also wanted to see exactly what the differences were between the 3 main skill settings, Rookie, Veteran, and Elite. So I let the first level of Bravo Sector play out on all 3 while staying off in the corner. And it turns out the main difference is that the higher settings simply have more enemies, which in some ways means you can amass more money, but it also means you're more liable to take damage, forcing you to buy more energy or shields. Also, as I mentioned before, the energy regeneration mechanic only works in Rookie and Veteran skill, not Elite. Plus, I noticed that bosses have half health on Rookie. So, I started my testing with the weapon the game gives you by default, the MG-21C Reaver Twin Machine Guns. Now, since this weapon fires incredibly rapidly, my first thought when gunning down the first boss with it was to measure the amount of game frames it took to beat the boss and translate that into a total quantity of shots. But at first, this didn't seem to be going well. One of the difficulties with doing this kind of time-based testing is you need to know your capture frame rate and the frame rate of the game itself. Now, the capture frame rate was 70 FPS, standard VGA 320x200 refresh, but I don't have a good means to measure the game frame rate, so I typically have to count it out manually. And I counted out 24, and since 24 is the de facto frame rate for movies, I figured that was probably it. But when I did the math to determine how many machine gun shots it took to beat the first boss, I got a fraction. I found that very curious, but I decided to keep going and test the next always equipped weapon, the Firestorm Plasma Cannon, which I've always felt was grossly underpowered, and sure enough, the battle against the boss using that weapon took a lot longer. But when I plugged the results into my math equations, I once again got an impossible number, especially after going back and counting each individual shot manually and noticing I wasn't actually all that far off. It took exactly 150 shots to defeat the boss, so I reversed my math equations and quickly realized the frame rate wasn't actually 24. It's 3 vertical blanks. Yeah, the game is timed by vertical syncing, but instead of waiting for just 1 vertical blank, it waits for 3. Now, if the game was running with a 60Hz display rate, waiting 1 vertical blank would be 60 FPS, 2 vertical blanks would be 30 FPS, and 3 vertical blanks would be 20 FPS. However, the standard VGA 320x200 mode runs at 70 Hz. This makes waiting for 1 vertical blank 70 FPS, 2 vertical blanks 35 FPS, and 3 vertical blanks 23 1/3 FPS. Yeah, the math works out now incredibly well, but trying to translate the resulting numbers into damage per second and cost to damage ratios results in some very awkward fractional values, most of which are multiples of thirds and ninths. So we'll talk about my solution to that later, and for now, just focus on getting all the damage rates figured out. I was also able to go back and adjust my math for the machine guns to figure out that they fire at a rate of 2 shots per 2 game frames, with each individual shot doing exactly half the damage of a plasma cannon shot, but at a much higher rate of fire, as the plasma cannon only fires 1 shot per 10 game frames. Yeah, turns out the effective damage rate of your starting machine guns, which only cost 12,000 credits to purchase, outpaced the DPS of the plasma cannon 5 to 1. Yet the plasma cannon costs 78,800 credits to purchase. Now, I get it, the plasma cannon is something that can be fired alongside all other weapons, so in a sense it's bonus damage, but it's such a tiny amount of bonus damage that you're only boosting your overall damage output by 20%, and only versus airborne targets, since the plasma cannon can't hit anything on the ground. Now let's contrast that to the micro missiles, the remaining always equipped weapon, which costs a little over twice as much as the plasma cannon at a cost of 175,600 credits, which also take 150 shots to take out the first boss, just like the plasma cannon, but fires 2 shots at a time and at a firing rate of a pair of shots every 4 game frames. When you do the math, this gives the micro missiles the same DPS as the starting machine gun, 5 times higher than the plasma cannon, but only a little over twice the cost, and can hit active ground targets, though not structures. Yeah, that was another thing I set out to quickly test, was to see which weapons could hit which kinds of targets, since the game only indicates distinctions between air and ground, but the reality is that there's effectively three classes of targets: airborne targets, active ground targets, and passive structures. You can tell the difference between an active ground target and a passive structure simply by how it explodes when you destroy it, as active ground targets have a higher pitched and quick explosion, just like airborne targets, while passive structures have a slower, lower pitched explosion, which chains to other nearby passive structures. Now, as it turns out, only 5 of the game's weapons, plus the Megabombs for 6, are able to hit structures, and I'll have all of those details listed when we get to the final results. So, to help speed things along, let's actually do some side-by-side comparisons, starting with 7 of the 9 selectable weapons which can target airborne enemies: the AIM-31 Mauler air-to-air missiles, the AARL-1201 Scatterpack missile pod, the Power Disruptor, which I learned actually does do some damage, the OD-55 Odin laser turret, the RX-1 Tsunami pulse cannon, the MSIL Atlas Death Ray, and finally the Cal-10 Eclipse twin lasers. And also the starting machine guns again, just for reference. I'm leaving out 2 of the weapons able to hit airborne targets because they're actually very inaccurate and can both hit ground targets, thus will test better against a stationary ground-based boss instead of a flying boss. Timing begins on all screens on the first bit of damage dealt and ends when the boss explodes, starting now. Yeah, once I tested all of the weapons, it became very obvious that the math behind the damage rates was incredibly simple, and allowed me to figure out that the first boss in Bravo sector has 300 hit points, and that each individual shot of the machine guns was doing a single point of damage, while every single firing rate was down to frames instead of seconds. Because of this, and given that the frame rate is exactly 23 1/3 frames per second, instead of measuring the DPS of every weapon, I'm electing to measure the DP9S of every weapon, or rather, damage per 9 seconds. Trust me, the numbers are a lot easier to grasp and look at doing it this way. And as we can see, a lot of the starting weapons are fairly equivalent to each other in terms of damage output, and don't always get stronger by cost, though sometimes it's understandable why not. But the Power Disruptor is very weak, despite costing 300,750 credits to purchase, but it has the secondary effect of blocking non-boss enemies from attacking. Now, this can have its uses, but given that you can't have other selectable weapons going at the same time, I find it's more trouble than it's worth to utilize. Or the Odin auto-tracking laser doesn't do anywhere near as much damage as you would expect for something that costs 512,850 credits, but it has the added benefit of not having to be aimed and is deadly accurate at any distance. But because its damage output isn't that high, it becomes increasingly useless as you get deeper and deeper into the missions, given that many enemies simply don't hang around long enough to get blasted apart by the thing. The Death Ray, however, puts almost all of the other weapons to shame, given that it's over twice as powerful as the Pulse Cannon, despite only costing about 30% more, while that Twin Laser is over 3 times more powerful than the Death Ray, while only being about twice the price. These 2 weapons are both kind of special too, in that they may only fire once every 7 frames, but their beams last for 4 frames and deal damage on each of those 4 frames, which I did indeed account for in the results on screen. Now, all of that said though, the Pulse Cannon is the strongest weapon that can hit both airborne targets and structures, so that may factor into your purchasing decisions, but hold that thought, because we're about to do the same testing with a grounded boss using weapons which can hit ground targets. For this test, we're going to be going up against the 5th level boss of Bravo Sector, which is the first ground-based boss you're going to run into over the course of normal gameplay, and has 600 hit points, exactly twice as much as the first level boss. Once again, we're going to have the regular machine guns for reference, but we're also going to be checking out the Mark 133 bombs, the AGM-26L Banshee air-to-ground missiles, the DM-1R Psycho Dumbfire missiles, which can target airborne enemies as well, but are horribly inaccurate against moving targets, the TH-19 Thor Auto-Track minigun, which again can target airborne enemies, but the manner in which it does so against bosses is slightly bugged, resulting in about 40% of all shots fired just not going where they're supposed to. So to test it properly, I'm going to be having the player's aircraft hovering directly above the boss so that the shots are guaranteed to hit. And once again, we'll be seeing the RX-1 Tsunami Pulse Cannon, since again, it's the most powerful weapon which can hit all three types of targets, airborne, ground, and structures. As before, timing starts on the first hit and ends when the boss explodes, starting now. I'll bet these results are kind of surprising at first glance, but there's a lot to unpack, so let's start with the most obvious one. The best weapon, which can target both ground targets and structures, is not the Pulse Cannon at a cost of 725,000 credits, but rather the air-to-ground missiles, which only cost 110,000 credits. Given that the cost difference between the Pulse Cannon and Death Ray is only 225,000, you can technically have better air and ground superiority by buying a combination of a Death Ray and air-to-ground missiles, switching between them as necessary, rather than just using the Pulse Cannon alone. But then the Pulse Cannon alone is indeed the cheaper option. However, if your primary concern is dealing with structures, then you actually have a better option, which actually doesn't look like a better option right now. The Mark 133 bombs. Yeah, I know, the damage output of the bombs is absolutely pitiful against ground targets, making even its low price point of 98,200 credits seem like a joke. But this is another weapon with a specialized purpose, since they're not only able to one-shot all passive structures, but do so with a one-tile wide blast radius, effectively being able to take out an entire 3x3 chunk of passive structures with a single bomb, to say nothing of the chain reactions following. To that end, while the bombs are absolutely worthless against active ground targets, and if you have any concerns about damaging structures, you're actually better off keeping the bombs on standby and just working your way up to the Death Ray and Twin Lasers. But the biggest disappointment by far has to be the DM-1R Psycho Dumbfire missiles. Why? Well, let's actually compare them with a different weapon, the AIM-31 Mauler air-to-air missiles. Notice something interesting? Yeah, they have the exact same overall damage output, yet the Maulers cost only 63,500 credits, while the Psychos cost over twice as much at 145,200 credits. Now true, the Psycho missiles can hit all target types, structures included, so there is a simplicity in using them, but again, they're incredibly difficult to aim as they have a degree of randomness, not just to the amount of time they spend dropping before engaging their engines, but also to their flight trajectory. A combination of both Maulers and Banshees would set you back a little more at a combined cost of 173,500 and would require actively switching between the two depending on what you're trying to hit, but are both much easier to aim. Anyways, before we get to the final compiled results, I also quickly tested the damage rate of the CBU-80 Guillotine Megabombs and the damage rate for ramming into things with your aircraft. Megabombs cost 32,250 credits, you can carry up to 5 at a time, and each does exactly 50 points of damage to everything on screen when they explode, with a maximum release rate of 1 Megabomb every 70 frames. Thus, their actual rate of damage is surprisingly low, but if you have the cash to burn, it's extra damage you can apply while blasting away with your other weapons. As for ramming targets, you generally shouldn't do this because you'll run your energy down real fast, but believe it or not, this is the fastest way to do damage in the entire game, even faster than the Twin Lasers, as your aircraft deals 15 points of damage per frame of contact. You can literally ram the first boss of Bravo Sector to death in under a second with this tactic. I mean, you're not going to actually survive this unless you have at least 4 phase shields or are cheating due to how much damage you take when you ram stuff, but it's technically an option. So yeah, it actually turned out surprisingly easy to measure all of this once I figured out what was up with the frame rate, and I'm very confident I've got all the numbers spot on with this one. Unlike sometimes when I do this kind of testing and can't figure out the real numbers at all because of random chance or other weird idiosyncrasies. I'll have a link in the video description so you can download an image file with these results for reference, or to print out as desired, But now that we have all of the results up on screen, I want to do something a bit unusual. I've got a funny feeling Scott Host is going to eventually watch this video too, and after running through all of this and figuring these results out, I do want to propose a few small alterations to the game if he does indeed remake it in the future, all of which relate to these findings. The first thing I'd like to propose is making it possible to equip more than one plasma cannon at a time, whereby the cost to buy or sell them increases depending on how many you already have, and ultimately gets hard limited. I would suggest allowing for a maximum count of 5, with each additional one simply increasing the rate of fire, so that by the time you have 5 of them, you're effectively getting 5 times the firing rate and thus 5 times the damage, which would bring it up to being on par with the micro missiles. The second thing I'd like to propose is bumping up some damage rates. The Psycho Dumbfire missiles need to do a lot more damage to make them useful. Heck, they could even do with a slightly higher firing rate too. While the Odin auto-tracking laser and pulse cannon could also do with some damage buffs, though they don't need huge boosts, just small boosts. The third thing I'd like to propose is converting the power disruptor from a weapon into an augment for the Megabombs, whereby once you have the power disruptor, any Megabomb you launch will now cause an additional EMP discharge effect for several seconds, which will prevent all enemies except bosses from firing their shots. And the last thing I want to propose is adding something that's missing. We've looked at all of the weapons in this video, and what's the one kind of weapon we don't have amongst the entire group? Spreading weapons, i.e. weapons which fire a spread of shots instead of just shooting straight forward or auto-tracking. Yeah, I know spreading weapons aren't realistic, but now you're going to tell me death rays somehow are? I would suggest adding a special augment to purchase, which would make the micro missiles fire in a spread, starting with a 3-way spread with the possibility of going up to a 5-way spread if you buy 2 of those augments, with the second one being more expensive, as well as adding a brand new air-to-air missile weapon which launches a 4-way spread, so that it can spread damage more effectively, but is weak at dealing directed damage. You could call them, I don't know, AIM 410X Crossfire air-to-air missiles or something like that. Now, that's all I have to say about Raptor Call of the Shadows, but I did want to give a quick shout out to Scott's recent Steam re-release of his old game, Demonstar, which he originally put out in 1997 and has been working on for many months to update it to run on modern Windows. Now, I never played Demonstar until now. In fact, I hadn't even heard of it until I started following Scott on social media. But unlike Raptor, which was kind of its own thing, Demonstar definitely takes after the Raiden games, featuring red and blue ships with a similar appearance, a slower rate of movement, colored weapons which you upgrade by picking up multiples of the same weapon, and a number of other similarities, while at the same time doing things just a little differently than Raiden. One thing you have to get used to right away with Demonstar is, again, the whole design philosophy of picking your battles and being satisfied with not destroying absolutely everything. The enemies absolutely soak up the damage, which combined with the slow movement of your ship means you're going to get yourself killed if you try to go for every single target that comes on screen. Another thing you have to get used to is that if you switch weapon colors, you downgrade back to the first level of power, which may seem bad at first, but I've noticed every single stage has at least one super weapon power-up somewhere, which will max out your current weapon to its highest level of power, typically hidden about 2/3 through the stage. Thus, try to have your desired weapon equipped before you reach that point so you can max it out. One thing that's a little weird though is that the colored weapon power-ups don't all cycle to the same weapon colors. In fact, some don't cycle at all. This appears to be related to the specific targets you destroy, so once you know a particular weapon color is possible from a particular target, you can just go for that one. I've seen 3 weapon colors so far, yellow, blue, and red, with yellow being a spreading attack, blue being a straight multi-shot attack, and red being a high damage attack. Now, I definitely prefer red over the other 2 weapons, but I think there's a 4th color which I haven't yet encountered. I haven't actually had a chance to play the game all that much yet, and it's also brutally hard, like harder than the Raiden games even, so it may be a while before I see if there's one more weapon color to find and how it behaves. And last thing to point out is that every so often you get assaulted mid-level by the titular Demonstar, which opens up a weird void which starts firing shots directly at you. It doesn't always happen at the same points in time, but does seem to happen in similar spots. So anytime you see the Demonstar form, that seems to be a spot where you can see it form again in future runs, but it won't always. But yeah, the game's much more straightforward than Raptor, with a fun 80s aesthetic to the music, despite originally being a late 90s game, and is considerably more difficult. I think once Scott remakes Raptor, it'll end up being the better of the two experiences, but there's nothing fundamentally wrong with Demonstar, and it has a price tag of only $10 on Steam, so definitely worth checking out if you're interested to see what else Scott Host has been up to, or just happen to enjoy punishingly difficult 2D shooters. Manu, that'll be all for today's ADG Pro video. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now on February 17th, will be a standard review, episode 323, where we're finally going to be taking a look at one of the most pivotal real-time strategy games ever made. And that's keeping in mind I've already reviewed both Dune 2 and Command & Conquer, and there really weren't a lot of RTS games for DOS which can claim that level of popularity, so be sure to stay tuned to see which game I've got in store for you all. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to all the folks shown here supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show directly and see your name here as well, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.